So we're going to go ahead and get started pretty soon. So just as a quick overview of what's going to be happening over the course of this session is we're going to give our presenters an opportunity to kind of introduce themselves and share their general experience on the task force for revising those national physical education standards. We're going to allow them opportunity to give us a brief introduction into the standards, talk about this revised approach to physical literacy, the grade span indicators, and then what it looks like to prepare the next generation of physical educators using the revised standards. And then lastly, we'll end off with hopefully a good chunk of our time today, giving you all as audience members the opportunity to engage in a Q&A with our presenters today and ask some questions, share feedback, and hopefully share some of the things that you've been doing as it relates to presenting the standards or some things that you may be thinking about doing in some of the courses that you may have or in the classroom, whichever is most appropriate to you. All right, so we're right at 104. So there will be probably a few more people trickling in, but I want to go ahead and get started to be respectful of everyone's time. So my name is Dr. Corey Elijah Dixon. I am chairing this year our special interest group for ARA, our research and learning in physical education. And so SIG93. It's been a great opportunity, and this is the first of our monthly webinars that we'll do between now and our annual meeting later on next year. So the major theme and topic of today's webinar is discussing marking our flags, right? So we're introducing those new 2024 National PE standards, and we have with us Doctors Clancy, Seymour, and Langston Clark. From my experience, it's just been a pleasure working with and knowing both of these individuals, both as scholars and just as human beings here on planet Earth. Very insightful, very smart, just cool people, right? So I do think we're all in for a treat as it relates to saying some of the things that they'll have to share with us today. So without any further ado, I want to give an opportunity for both of you to please introduce yourselves to the group that we have today, and possibly share a little bit just about your overall experience working with the task force over the last few years.
Let me stop
After
muting.
you, yeah, you go first.
Being a person that's on mute when you're supposed to be starting stuff, so I apologize for that. So yes, I think I know at least half the folks who are here with us today. My name is Langston Clark, and I am a professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And I've been with the standards task force, I think from the beginning. I think Corey and I were there from jump, and it's so long ago. I don't even know how long ago it was that we started. So we went through multiple iterations of what the standards would look like, potentially what they would be. You all don't know this in the audience, but what Corey does and Clancy, we started with a whole pizza thing. The pizza thing went away and become some other things. So it was an intense process. It was a process that we really appreciate people in our universe contributing their feedback to how this thing evolved and became what are now the new national standards. And so appreciate all of you here to be part of this conversation today. And then I'll tag in my partner Clancy for him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Langston, and thanks, Corey, for inviting us. It's an honor. Again, a lot of familiar faces. We've come, cross paths in many different events, and it's again just a pleasure to be able to be here and visit and learn from each other. I would be remiss if I didn't include Corey in the mix, who was also a part of the National Standards Task Force, and getting this to the finish lines for sure. So his work was instrumental. I believe Langston's right. It was a long endeavor. I think I served for almost 2 years, and it might have been a 3-year endeavor on the task force. So that was exciting indeed. I'm a professor and director of the health, physical education, and sport pedagogy programs at Canisius University. I'm embarking on my 26th year, so it's been a long time at Canisius and proud of it. I was chatting with Dominique at the beginning. I'm a proud Canadian originally, but been living here for a long time now. So lots of fun. And again, just a pleasure to be here with all of you and learn from one another.
I definitely appreciate both of you being here again. And so thanks for sharing those introductions. I want to jump into a few of the questions that I have that are going to kind of guide the beginning part of our conversation before we open it up to general comments and questions as we go along. So the first is just, can you just simply give us a brief overview to the 2024 PE standards? So just an overview of what we really should be looking for. What are some of the main differences and changes? What's new this year?
Well, I'm assuming most of you have seen them already, but if not, I'll just kind of go through them real quick, right? Standard 1 develops a variety of motor skills. Standard 2 applies knowledge related to movement and fitness concepts. Standard 3 develops social skills through movement, develops personal skills, identifies personal benefits of movement, and chooses to engage in physical activity is Standard 4. And I think one of the things that stands out to me, there was like a recurring theme throughout our process of, developing the standards, really kind of stands out in Standard 3. And this idea of developing your social skills through movement. And so that idea in Standard 3 came out because we wanted to emphasize that the context for which we were having all the different forms of learning would occur through movement, and wanted to make sure that was an emphasis. And so thematically, something that stands out to me in terms of how we thought about developing the standards, that we were anchored in this idea that learning happens through movement.
Yeah, I think Langston covers it well. Several iterations of the national standards. Now, I think this is the 4th iteration from 96 on. And in each instance, you've seen the reduction from 7 down to 6, down to 5, down to 4. So I think Corey's got some questions related to historical context and perhaps, the future directions, and we can get to that later. I don't think that was intentional in this process, that's for sure. I can't speak to the other years during revision that it was always the impetus for reduction. I don't think that's ever been the impetus. But the only thing I would add to what Langston brought into what Langston reviewed was that we're down to 4. We're more crystallized with the affective domain and the split between the affective domain and the social domain. So that's reflected in Standard 3 and 4. We recognize too the value of the skills and knowledge of fitness to be infused and embedded within all standards. Langston brought up the idea of movement, and that everything is from a movement context. Whether we're talking about Standard 1 or Standard 4, everything is always from a movement context, and fitness is a part of that. So that's kind of more the approach that we took with fitness. We look at that as more holistic and organic, as a part of fitness. Should always be a part of the conversation when we're talking about learning concepts in physical education. We want to teach the children how to fish. We don't want to feed them the fish. Fitness itself is short term. Learning about physical fitness is long term. So that's kind of the process, and that's kind of the overview that I see.
Awesome. Thank you for that. One of the big changes that we noticed is the shift from 5 standards to 4 standards. Could you give us some insight on the rationale behind that change?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what Clancy was getting at, right? And so in the article that came out in Jerford, it says the change occurred because rather than emphasizing one standard that encompassed fitness, that the new standards thought about fitness as being all encompassing throughout all of the different standards. So it's not just marked in one place, but the focus is expanded so that fitness is something that is meant to be throughout each of the standards. So that had to deal with some of the changes in the combining of the standards and things like that. So it wasn't to exclude anything but to recognize that certain concepts permeate throughout. And so that was the rationale for that.
I would agree.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that insight. Over the last several years, I would say all of us in some capacity have become familiar with the idea of the physically literate individual, right? We think about our last iteration of standards that was a prominent in the wording and how we kind of conceptualize the not only the standards, but what the purpose of the standards are and kind of what that outcome would be. So with this new redefined approach to physical literacy, can you give us some insight on the physical literacy journey and how that conceptualization supports lifelong engagement in physical activity throughout one's life?
So it's interesting. I remember these conversations, and how we had some traditional definitions of physical literacy. And I like, this is one of the meetings I remember the most because we did this for 3 years. So we had tons of meetings. And the conversation was, can your physical literacy throughout your lifespan vacillate? Right. So as I'll try to use this example, it may not be the most appropriate, but I remember being in middle school, right? And there were certain things I could do in middle school really well because I had a good physical education foundation. But for whatever reason, something happened like my freshman, sophomore year where like I couldn't do the same things that I was doing in middle school. And so my ability to do certain activities vacillated because physical literacy isn't like a linear process. Sometimes you get better at an activity, sometimes you get worse at it, sometimes you're more physically fit, sometimes you're less physically fit. And so we wanted to recognize that this isn't something where you necessarily start at point A and wind up at point B. That physical literacy wasn't truly like a journey that one goes through ebbs and flows throughout their lifespan. And so we recognize that it happens across a continuum, but not necessarily just in a straight line, but potentially back and forth in some instances.
Yeah, I would agree. Langston's spot on. It's a continuum. It's a journey. As it's suggested, and it changes and is always evolving. And I think that's again a question for the that Corey has posed to us to consider. Future directions. Recognizing the importance of physical education, not only in the short term, but its transcendence, its transfer in the long term, and that's kind of the connection that we considered with physical literacy. The definition of physical literacy remains the same: competence, confidence, motivation, multiple environments, physical activity for a lifetime. That's all the same. But recognizing that journey looks different for everyone, and it's always evolving and changing, and how we move now could be altogether different in the future. But instilling the confidence for children that when they get far beyond K through 12, that they have the confidence to be able to adapt and try new movement experiences and endeavors to again to continue living a healthy lifestyle. That's kind of where we see that. And the other piece too is that recognizing that physical literacy is a societal goal. It's not physical education. Physical education is a large partner in contributing and supporting physical literacy, but it's not physical education. Physical education is different. Physical education has its purpose too, and it supports physical literacy.
Thank you for those pieces of clarification. Another aspect of the standards that we became familiar with in the past is the subset of the grade level outcome. So from kindergarten all the way through high school, we had a pretty nuanced list of different particular outcomes that we could expect at different grade levels. What's new with this iteration of the standards, and what terminology has changed this time around?
So yeah, I think you kind of highlighted it in the question, right? So we went from grade level outcomes to grade span learning indicators. And so this approach is more inclusive while emphasizing meaningful movement and learning experiences for all children in physical education. So it further supports a childhood developmental perspective that recognizes that um, human growth in many capacities. And so basically, I'm reading that from the article, but basically, like, we take a developmental approach to physical education, right? So um, something that, I maybe knew about, you can know something, but not have learned it and have it not be concrete for you. Something like that happened to me as I moved here to San Antonio, right? And so um, we have children in high school who can't ride bikes. And so there are PE teachers that literally have like, there's like bikes that travel around different schools at different time of the year, teaching like 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, maybe even 18-year-olds how to ride a bike. Now we look at that as something that might happen with somebody who's 5, 6 years old. But to be inclusive of where like all our students were, like we have to be able to provide them with opportunities in physical education that meet them where they are, and recognize that students are on different parts of their journey, developmentally, or even with access to opportunities to learn, to develop and to grow physically. So that was sort of the switch from like the emphasis on the grade to like thinking about it as a span rather than like the actual like grade level outcomes.
Yeah, well said. And the previous work from our predecessors has been fantastic. The 2013, for example, 2013 grade level outcomes were, again, a fantastic, a huge step. But probably unintentionally prescriptive. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to think about, just as Langston mentioned, that, you know, development, childhood development, whether we're talking about largely movement, motor movement, or social development or mental and cognitive development, is not age related but age dependent. So this is kind of why we went in this direction of learning indicators and learning progressions, because for example, the learning progressions that are in the book are an example. They're not the example, meaning that there could be many other progressions in among and between. So that's the idea, the inclusive approach to building and recognizing that development is not linear with every child. A child may be really strong from a movement capacity, but from a social side of things, maybe not. And that's okay too. So that's kind of what we were thinking when we went to this approach, the idea of trying to be more inclusive instead of prescriptive.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for that insight as well. One of the biggest things that I was hoping to have the opportunity to talk with you all about today was what it really looks like to start preparing the next generation of physical educators. So we have individuals even on this call that represent K-12 settings and higher education settings. And so what type of guidance or recommendations could you give teacher educators specifically on integrating the new standards? What may that look like in methods courses, and how we talk to student teachers, pre-service teachers about really utilizing these standards effectively?
Um, as best we could, we tried to be intentionally inclusive of as many people who would be experiencing physical education as possible. And so I have to give a shout out to Dr. Dillon at Texas Women's University, because she did a lot of the wordsmithing with the standards and how we describe the standards, and I'm sure even in Corey in the book, right? To make sure that we were very particular with the words that we used. And so I would just say that as we think about, training the next generation of PE teachers, as we think about the current generation of PE teachers and physical educators, physical education teacher educators, to be mindful of using the standards in a way that is as inclusive as possible, so that we have the broadest impact on all the students who are coming to, our classrooms, and all the students who we will be sending out into gymnasiums and classrooms and fields and things like that. And I think the words that we use to describe what we do is very important. And so we all, like those of us who are preparing future teachers, right? we have to look at state standards, right? We have to look at lesson plans and things like that. And so some of you may have the opportunity to be developing state standards and things like that. So I would just say be mindful of how, you know, the standards trickle down and how we try to have the best and broadest impact for all the students who will be experiencing physical education.
Well said, Langston. I would add, physical education is for all. That was a premise and a mantra that we continued to remind each other during our work, that physical education is for all. So, how do we train future practitioners, or how do teacher educators consider utilizing the standards? Well, first, recognizing that the standards are exactly what they are, and that is the code, the guiding light, if you will, the aims of our discipline. It's not the curriculum. The curriculum is developed by the expert practitioners, the teacher educators that fuel and teach our future professionals. And it's up to the practitioner in the trenches to build the curriculum that aligns to the code. And what perhaps a PE curriculum may look like where Dr. Vandermars is in Arizona might be altogether different than where it looks like in me in Buffalo, New York. But as long as it aligns to the standards in its own meaningful way, that's fantastic. That's what we have to do. We have to use the standards as what they were intended to be, and that's a guiding light, and certainly not the curriculum. You, the practitioners, the experts in the trenches, you develop the curriculum that aligns to the code.
And I also think, like, one of the things that we try to do in the Joe Pert article and in the Spectrum article was like talk about how these standards look different from previous versions of the standards, but they're not like, this is not like a radical transformation of the standards, you know. So I think it's like you can build on, like, for those of us who are in you know, teacher educators, we can build on looking at what the previous standards were and like look at what those changes are as a teaching tool for like our students who are coming through. Also want to add with the Spectrum article that's coming out in Clancy, I cannot remember when it's coming out. So
the strategies article is coming out in November.
Yeah.
I believe.
So the strategy article is coming out in November. And so we actually have people who are on the task force who are K through 12 physical education teachers. And I think we have somebody else who does curriculum at a district level, talk about how they actually give practical suggestions for the physical educator on how to integrate the new standards into, you know, their practices and things like that. So.
Well, thank you. We're definitely looking forward to that. We're getting close to turning over the Q&A to our audience members. I want to be very mindful to leave time for that, but I have one more burning question that you kind of started to touch on already, and that I would like to ask this question before we turn it over. Like you mentioned, the current iteration of the standards built heavily upon what was done in the past. It could be possible that there are audience members, individuals on this call who will serve on the next task force for the standards, or the task force after that. So with that being a possibility, what advice or insight or encouragement or recommendation would you have for the next task force? What do you see as some future directions for the way the standards might evolve from now over the next 6 to 8 years, and what may that look like?
I would start, I think one of the things that we started with was understanding the context we were in, right? And so when we started the standards, Corey, we were still like, it was still peak COVID, right? And so, so that context of peak COVID was in the back of our minds as we were developing the standards from the very beginning. And so part of the evolution of where we started to where we are now is about like literally how we started in the middle of COVID and now things are becoming more and more normalized. And so that kind of shaped the evolution of what we were doing. So I think, you know, anyone who is thinking about being on a task force in the next however many years, really considering the context that you're going to be in, that physical education is going to be in when that happens. Schools are going to be like, schools can be totally different, you know? What's that? Didn't the Vision Pro come out? What's the thing that Apple just came out with? And it's like, kids gonna be putting a helmet on, going to school,
Yes.
some of them.
Yeah.
So what is that gonna look like for us as physical educators, and how we like build standards that might be digitally, because kids will be moving, but they might be moving at home like Ready Player One with some device on their head and like,
In somewhat of a stationary space.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a good
all
point.
over their body, and they'll just be doing this. So um the context is going to be important, and the politics of the day are also going to be important for what language you use or can and cannot use for how you develop the standards. So I think those are some key things to be mindful of.
That's great, Langston. I hadn't thought of it that way. This question, Corey, I have to be 100% honest with you. And again, for the benefit of our audience, Corey was gracious enough to send us the questions a little bit in advance to help us kind of focus our thoughts. And this one, I was like, wow, that's a really good question. He stumped me on this. I had to think about this one for a while. So well done to Corey. So, Langston's ideas are fantastic. Hadn't thought of it from that context. The things that I came up with: one, we have I talked about the code versus the curriculum analogy, the idea that PE programs are disparate across states and across the country, and we have to be respectful of the local autonomy of PE practitioners in the trenches. So that being said, we have many states now that have state standards. So the idea of how can we develop a set of national standards that are easily aligned to state standards, or the connection to state standards in the future, I think is something that that didn't come up as much in our conversations in this task force, that I think is something that we always have to consider. The other thing that I had thought of with this is, something that I bring up with my my teacher candidates, is that physical education is a very unique um, stage. We have a very difficult job. We teach, and these four standards mirror that. We teach to the psychomotor, say it loud, say it proud, we're physical education, but we also teach to the cognitive and the social and the affective domain. We have a tremendous challenge, but we also have a tremendous opportunity, because we have an opportunity in the K through 12 sphere in physical education. Other disciplines do not. We get to include movement. We get to include mental and cognitive development and social development and affective and personal development. All of those learning domains to develop growth, or to see a child grow. That's a really wonderful opportunity, but it's hard. I I would like to see the standards continue to try to build on that community connection, and the idea that these standards and K through 12 PE is unique and different from any other discipline, and that phys ed lasts for a lifetime.
Mm.
Children become moving adults, and we have a tremendously hard challenge, but we have a tremendous opportunity to prove that physical education and health education are among the most important disciplines in the K through 12 sphere, just for that very point, that all children become adults and healthy citizens, hopefully, and move for a lifetime.
Thank you for that. You guys, I mean, you can hear the passion from the brothers that we have here on this call today. This is one of the reasons why in the future, by 2030, 2040, we can't have ChatGPT writing our standards. Okay. Or should we, right? Who knows?
Yes.
But I think there's an intangible factor that just comes from the human nature of the individuals that happen to be on the task force throughout the different years. And so I think that's a unique part of it. Hey, I could sit and talk to these guys all day. I got plenty more questions, but I want to make sure I'm leaving time for y'all to be able to ask questions as colleagues, as stakeholders, as community members. And so what we'll do is we'll kind of open up the floor for questions, comments, or feedback, and you can use the raise hand feature. You can put something in the chat, and we'll try our best to address every question and comment that you all may have. My plan is to be officially slash unofficially wrapping things up by around 2 o'clock Eastern for those who may have something else on their calendar, but I want to at least leave a good portion of time for this part of our conversation. So if anybody would like to go ahead and throw a hand up or unmute and to get this conversation going or to keep it going, now would be a great time to do that.
I can help jumpstart if you want, Corey. You sent us a question about the historical context.
Okay.
And I thought that was a really interesting question as well about, what has influenced us in this particular iteration, from a societal and historical context. And, I'll let Langston add on to this, but I kind of already mentioned it. But first and foremost, and I think Dr. Vandermars could help us a lot with his experience and others alike, but I think in the past, the purpose of physical education has been muddled, and we've seen the fantastic scholars in our profession articulate that. And I don't think we're out of the woods just yet, but I think we're getting closer to understanding what the purpose of physical education is. To quote, I like the framework that Dr. Arnold from Australia came up with: in movement, through movement, about movement. That's something I utilize and think about a lot. So I think we're better. I think we're closer to understanding what the purpose of physical education is, and that has helped us come up with a more operational set of standards that I think are applicable and demonstrable and measurable for all. On top of that, recognizing that physical education is for all. So I think those key pieces really helped us from a historical and societal context with this current iteration of standards.
That's a great point. Would anybody like to add on to that or ask another question?
I can go ahead and ask a question,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Of course.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you first of all, for the work, previously being on a standard task force for the initial standards for physical education, teacher education. I know how hard it is to work and come up with a consensus. So thank you. So you talk about 4 standards. Two of the 4 standards are concerned with the affective domain, correct? One is concerned with the cognitive domain, and one is concerned with the psychomotor domain. So you certainly talk about that you look through the lens of movement, but when I see the standards, I see 50% of them being targeted to the affective domain. My question to you, what was the consideration to move away? I mean, to me, it's like moving away from the psychomotor domain, which is what you actually talked about earlier. Yeah, I get it that we have to teach the affective and the social skills, but it seems to me by putting 2 out of the 4 on the affective and social domain, you're kind of, seems to me like you're moving away from the actual subject matter of our field, from my take.
It's a good question. So I'll add in my 2 cents, and Langston, if you want to add as well. But if you look, I'm not sure that I think we're better. I think our standard 3 and 4 now are better organized into what is now standard 3, the social, and standard 4, the affective domain. Affective being more personal, and then the social domain being the interaction of movement within, among others. Okay, so if you look at previous iterations of the standards, 4 and 5, in 2013, we could say was the affective domain. We had 2 standards back then. We had 2 standards in 2003. We had 2 standards at least in 1996. So we've always had multiple standards that relate to the affective and social domain. But on top of that, Jose, the only thing I would add is that the emphasis of movement has never dissipated. If we're teaching children how to play in the sandbox while doing mathematics, then it's not physical education. We're teaching children how to socially engage in physical activity or movement-related experiences. That's standard 3. So movement must always be present in some capacity.
Yeah.
It's never been taken away. That's my answer.
So this is interesting. kind of like brings me back to that introduction to like research concepts and things like that in graduate school back at UT. So Bob and Aaron know this. And so the professor who taught the class introduced me to this concept called hermeneutics. And basically like hermeneutics is like what you bring to what you read, right? And so I just want us to be careful, to be mindful of like what we bring to when we're reading the standards, and let the standards speak to us, so that we can like clearly and like really understand what they're saying. So like as I go through, like just at a glance, standard 1 has motor skills, right? Standard 2 says movement and fitness concepts. Standard 3 says through movement. Standard 4 says identifies personal benefits of movement and chooses to engage in physical activity. So like if we were just going through like the words that are literally there, right? The movement and the body and the physical activity and the fitness is in every standard. And then also like going to the Joe Pert article, there's a rationale for every standard that provides more depth and more insight into, you know, why we chose to frame the standards the way that we did.
I think that's you know, those are interesting, you know, insights, and I think that's a good question as well. When I look at
For
the
sure.
standard, one of the things that was a challenge in my mind was how to present the standards as well, because I think some of us, we think in ways that are very you know, for me, I see things kind of in patterns. I like to see a logical flow, and so if I'm looking at the standards, it's hard for me not to see number 1 as most important, number 2 is secondly important, third, and then fourth. And if I'm looking at the standards, and you know, one is about this domain, 2 is about that domain, 3 and 4 are about this domain, it's hard not to see that imbalance. But similar to what my colleagues have said, I think that we're really looking for more of a cohesion and an integration across, so that each standard doesn't necessarily just exclusively represent one domain, but that each standard in some capacity entertains each of the domains in ways that we think are meaningful, and definitely an intentionality to try to keep movement as a main concept throughout. And so I do think it would be you know, I don't think it would be the best fit to look at each standard representing a domain exclusively and to look for that balance there, but to really look at it in the rationales and those progressions as they go through, to kind of see that movement should always be an aspect, if not the main aspect, for most of the lessons that we teach, regardless of which standard we're working on most.
So Tori had a good question in the chat. And basically it's like, what was the biggest pushback to the new standards when working with the task force, if any? And
Great question.
That's a good question, because there was, I think, and like Clancy and Corey, y'all can like, y'all have your own hermeneutic or perspective of like pushback and things like that. I don't know if I view pushback as pushback. I think I viewed like pushback as us needing to clarify like what we meant with what we were saying throughout the process. Because from like, I think from very early on in our conversations, we were adamant about all of the standards being anchored in something to deal with the psychomotor domain. Like that was always sort of like the foundation for what we were doing. So things were happening either through movement, in a movement context, right? In the context of the words that we use changed throughout the process, but movement was always there. And so I think that there were folks who were really concerned that we were veering away from, you know, who we really are. But I think the way that we viewed it was that we were infusing who we are in all aspects in each of the learning domains, and making sure that who we are is prominent in every aspect of physical education from the standards perspective.
I would agree. And I think Jose's question is excellent, and I think it did come up, whether we call it pushback or feedback. I think that question was posed to us throughout the entire process, and it's something that we as a committee chatted long and hard about. And I think that's where we're at now, is recognizing that movement is present throughout. So that was certainly a question that was asked of us from a pushback context. The other one that came up that perhaps Corey and Langston remember as well is, what about assessment, or how is this the curriculum of PE? And, I think as the years go on, we, just like I brought up the idea about, we're understanding more and more what physical education is and the purpose of physical education. I think the same is the case with educational standards. We understand what they are and what they're not, and what they're certainly not is curriculum. And assessment is part of the curricular process, the pedagogy that you deploy. So it's up to you as the practitioner to align, again, your instruction with accompanying assessments that align to the standards themselves.
I also want to add, like, we had multiple groups of stakeholders that we had to take feedback from. And so we have camps, right? We have camps in the Pete Academy, right? So you have stakeholders within stakeholders. So you got the camps within Pete, but then we have like teachers, we have people who are like in charge of curriculum at district levels and state levels and things like that, who are all giving us feedback, who all have different needs. And so one of the challenges was balancing out, really honing in on what, the physical educators K through 12 needed, or what was practical for them, while also satisfying the expectations of the academy, was something that we had to be very mindful of as we built these.
Indeed. I mean, we even sought, if I recall, the policies and educational aims and standards of other countries and other areas where physical education is growing and prominent as well. So good point, Langston.
Definitely. And I would say, as far as, pushback or feedback, I would say a lot of the pushback we got was centered around the process more so than the product. I think the route we took to get to where we got was a bit, it was the scenic route, if you will.
Right.
We had various documents that came out along the way, and iterations that came out along the way that were representative of the way we were processing things. And I think a lot of those things look very unfamiliar to a lot of the people that were looking at them. And so I think our process was a bit more, unique based on who was on the force and what that looked like. But I would say the closer we got to the final product, including all of the feedback and the expertise that was within and outside of the task force, I think there's a lot more agreement there. And so I think that was pretty cool. And well, yeah, I'll stop there. I want to give everybody a chance to continue to share. So, any other questions, comments, feedback, responses?
I do have a question. My name is Sean Fullerton. I'm a first year faculty here at Towson. And, one thing that I've kind of noticed, and this is kind of like to the group, I was just curious. One thing that I've noticed is that, I've seen teachers in the field that will, have their curriculum or their activities, whatnot, and then they will just like slap on a standard and they'll say it's standards based. And I kind of see, I will often see a misalignment between the standard and then the learning activities to be able to practice those skills, and then the assessment. So sometimes I'll see that disconnection. And then when working with the pre-service teachers here, I really emphasize, what does standards-based look like? What does an authentic assessment look like for this standard? What do learning activities look like that are aligned with the standard? And, we'll go over a bunch of things, rubrics, we'll talk about activities, whatnot. And then once the standard gets in the mix, it seems like it kind of destabilizes their comfort, their confidence. It kind of like throws a wrench in the whole thing. Is there any recommendations or of introducing these to pre-service teachers or K-12 teachers and really hitting home, because like the point was made that it's up to them to align the activities and the assessment, and the standards are just that one piece. Is anybody else like seeing those challenges, and then like, is there any recommendations for how to introduce these to pre-service teachers when it comes to planning curriculum, planning assessments?
Wow, Sean, music to my ears. That sounds like wonderful steps you're taking with your teacher candidates. That many of us I think try to do as well. I think you hit on a good point. To me, it's the old paralysis of analysis almost. They overthink what the purpose of the standards are themselves. It's not like the teacher candidate, or for that matter, the master teacher in the trenches, sits in front of the audience at some point and says, today we're going to learn about this, and it aligns to standard 1 of the national P. It doesn't happen that way. And I think we have to do a better job perhaps of trying to communicate that point to our teacher candidates, if that makes sense.
But on the other end, if I piggyback on this, I mean, I don't think that the math teachers would say this is the standards that we are teaching today, right? Like,
Correct.
so the standards are there to, I'm teaching a curriculum and assessment course at the graduate level right now. They are all teachers in the field. And they just finished kind of a self-evaluation of their program based
Nice.
and to what extent it's a standard base or not, and what they could do. And
Yes.
I have nine students in there, 9 teachers in there, and none of them uses the standard as their basis to plan. They plan based on the activity that they're using, and then just like you said, Sean, they just kind of, all right, which standard then do I address by using this activity? And it is the reality of especially if they're in a secondary school where everything is dictated by the space they have and the equipment they have and the climate. I mean, here, I know for a fact I'm in Virginia, it's been raining for the last week. There's a lot of kids in the gym right now because they cannot be outside to play soccer or softball or whatever. So I guess my point is that as much as the textbook that I use is, standard-based physical education, and that we're trying to push this, the reality is that, yes, there you go, Kelly.
I got it here too. It's up here.
It is the reality of the planning is what activity, and then what can I put in, what standards am I going to address with this specific unit and this specific unit? So I don't know, Sean, how to do it, because I've been struggling with this. And even though, we talk about those standards, and I guess to a certain extent, and here in Virginia, we have state standards. So I was curious, to see how much they still align, because they're brand new, 2024 as well. So, but to what extent, it is a bad thing, I don't know. As long as they try to really align with what they're supposed to be teaching.
Sure. Well, Dominique, that's a great point, and I think maybe that's a gap. That's an area where we can start to build resources that align to the standards. In New York State, we have a resource where we take content in PE across all the domains and align it to the standards of the state. So now it's organized in a framework that practitioners can see, feel, and touch. And maybe that would help to mitigate some of the problems that Sean is referring to. I don't know. I think we got a couple people raising their hands too.
Yeah. So Sean, I hope we answered your question. If you wanted to jump offline about this, I'd be happy to talk about it more with you. I've had the same challenge, and I think some successful strategies, semi-successful strategies. So we could definitely talk about that more. So we saw Aaron's hand and then Hans, but Aaron, let's hear from you first, please.
I was actually just gonna respond to Sean's question, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, sorry everybody, my camera's off. I'm driving. So, um, Sean, I think that it's not just a pre-service question, as Dominique was alluding to, like it is kind of like in-service teacher issue as well. Um, so I'm at the University of Hawaii, and I think a couple of strategies that we've used is to model or provide opportunities for students to see it modeled in the classroom. So we do have teachers, and there are some schools where there's expectations that the standards are posted on the board and that teachers like talk about them with their students. And so trying to expose students to that and talk about the importance of it is one way that we try to like ingrain it. But I think the other thing is for us is trying to make it consistent throughout our programming and talking about how like in our lesson plan template, the standard comes first. It's not, and it's not just the standard itself. Like we talk a lot in the old standards about the grade level outcomes and how you can't just talk about the standard because I mean, they're just so broad, right? So they need to be looking at it deeper, and then they need to be thinking about the activities that are going to allow for that to happen, or to be able to meet that. And then the assessment, as you were talking about, aligns to that. But you can't just talk about that in methods class and in student teaching and not move it forward. And so trying to be more consistent across our faculty is one way that we're trying to improve the way that our students think about it. Because the reality is, you know, we introduce them to all of the standards in our introduction to PE and health course. And when they get into their methods course, they say, oh, we don't know the standards, or we've never been exposed to them. And we're like, you literally read 2 full textbooks about standards. And like you went through these experiences, right? But that's just the reality of it. And the reality is that they're not going to remember right away. And so trying to be consistent across the curriculum, I think, is also important.
Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
I assume you're referring to me.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes.
Did Erin just jump off? No, there she is. I'm sorry, Erin. I didn't mean to lose you there. Erin, one of the problems is that if you look at the Chronicle of Higher Education last week or the week prior, there was a pretty good announcement of a webinar that talks about students, and this is university students. But I suspect it probably has trickled down to high school students as well, is that kids just don't read anymore. And so we have a huge problem on our hand. The problem with the word standards, when using it with pre-service teachers and you know, bless their heart, K-12 teachers in physical education settings, is that kids don't relate to that word. And I think at the root of it lies the fact that our field has failed to have any focus on learning. We basically disavowed learning something, whether it's knowledge related, whether it's psychomotor related. I won't get into the problems around social and emotional development because that's a whole different webinar. But there's just no focus on learning. And I think the field needs to pay attention much more to the fact that when Judy Plasek years ago talked about busy, happy, good, if that's the conception of success in teaching, we're in deep shit, folks. I mean, and that's still pervasive. And I hate to use this crude language, but we're in trouble. If we don't create a culture of learning, which is critical, then we're toast. And you know, I know the word assessment has been floated around, and that of course is always the elephant in the room, because nobody wants to talk about assessment, doing real assessments. The new standards have no assessment mechanisms associated with it at this point. I know that apparently the new PE metrics are being resuscitated, and we'll have to see what that looks like. But given the limited amount of time that teachers have to actually teach and instruct, I'm not sure how assessment will figure into that. I'll stop there. I've already bloviated enough. So.
Thank you for those insights. I know in my methods courses, the one thing that I get hung up on every semester is that physical education, first and foremost, is it's a learning process. When you start to try to understand what it is and understanding what learning is and how learning happens, and then how to see evidence that learning has occurred. But I definitely think there's a current deficit in that approach right now and what's happening in classrooms, higher ed.
Corey, these kids that come to our programs, they've been witness to an experience for most of them, where learning was not an expectation.
Hmm.
Okay, if you're on time, if you're dressed according to the policy for short shirts and no open toed shoes and stuff and shit like that, excuse my French. If you behave, oh yeah, and if you try, you're guaranteed an A. Well, what kind of level of expectation is that? So sorry, I thought I was going to shut up, but I guess I didn't.
Absolutely, I absolutely understood. Thank you for that. Uh, we have another hand. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, y'all. Good morning. Um, to respond to Hans, I'm curious in regards to new standards, the concept of busy, happy, good. You're kind of stating that the new approach may result in more busy, happy, good, and I I don't understand. I guess what is why would the new standards create that situation more than past standards?
I'm not sure if the new standards will make students be more busy, more happy, more good. I don't know. It remains to be seen. I suspect they'll be less active, um, but that's to be determined, I guess, Bob.
Okay, yeah. So I must have read it,
The whole
heard it
busy,
wrong.
the whole
Sounded like
busy,
you were
happy,
saying that
good.
the standards would do that.
Sorry, the whole busy, happy, good concept didn't flow out of anything related to standards.
Hmm.
So.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
That's a good point that Robert brings up. Hans is, so when you mention the assessments that aren't included with the 2024, are there assessments with 2013?
You're
I,
currently still muted. Yep.
I'd have to double check, but I don't remember if there were assessments listed with the 13 or 14 standards, but I know the previous one did. There was a link with
P
it.
metrics was the
No, it wasn't PE metrics. That was a whole separate endeavor.
I'm not aware of assessments with other versions of standards. Maybe I'm off.
Well,
But
that's
P metrics,
one of the problems. That's one of the problems with our
right.
subject, that is the standards never really get integrated with assessment. So.
Right. You are right though. PE Metrics 4th edition is on the docket.
It would have been nice. It would have been nice if that had been finished at the time that the Baltimore conference.
Yeah.
Or sorry, where were we? Oh, in Cleveland. Sorry, yeah.
Cleveland, yes.
Aaron, see your hand again.
Sorry, I know we're at time. And Hans, I don't disagree with you about like assessment being important, but I mean, when other standards are released, like I don't think they have assessments. Like if we look at assessments across like subject areas, assessments are very specific to curriculum and context, right? So I don't know if it would be appropriate to release assessments with standards, because it should be context specific in how you're assessing your students, not like a blanket. Now, of course, we could do a better job of like providing examples, but the problem with examples is people take them for truth, right? And how it should be, and that might not be the intention of it. But
well, if you look at the standards, which I've done in the last 3 years, 4 years, you look at math, English language arts, art. No, they don't explicitly in the standards themselves. They don't list assessments. Okay. They also don't list anything related to emotional or social development, incidentally, and that might be something that the group might need to pay attention to. Because in the earlier word, somebody, I think it was Clancy, who mentioned that we are unique. Well, I would suspect that your math and English language arts professors in your college would probably be pretty pissed, because they all think they are unique. Every subject is unique. Every subject tries to work on kids behaving well and being constructive and cooperating and working together in teams and stuff. We are no different than other subjects. We're all unique. And so anyway, I'm digressing. It's not physical education. It's not physical education alone that can work on kids' social and emotional development. Okay, it's the entire school, it's the entire community, it's the parents at home, it's the peers in the hood when they're still playing, if they're still playing, that is. You know, for physical education to claim that we alone can help kids develop socially and emotionally is just folly. We're in a state of delusion if we really think that. I mean,
Do you think that?
former Shape America president actually made that claim in an article, that you know, we're the ones who came up with it.
Right.
That just doesn't connect.
I would
Yeah.
agree. It's a pretty back to the goals and purpose of physical education for sure. And it certainly shouldn't be incumbent upon only physical educators to have to develop the social side of growth and development as well, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think if physical education were to try to bear the brunt of that load on behalf of all of the subjects and areas and parents and communities where all these other responsibilities should lie, that would be inappropriate. I think for me personally, where I see the main push for some of that social and affective development as it relates to physical education specifically is the desire and the necessity to continue to push individuals to be movers beyond high school. And so, what that looks like and how we can attract and help people learn in different categories, I think is important. I learned a lot from Dr. Peter Hasty while I was at Auburn about pedagogy and
Sure.
movement. And I felt like I was trained by one of the best, you know. And so I felt when I went out to one of my main teaching assignments at a youth development center, I took this knowledge and these skill progressions and these activities, and I was implementing those things. And there was still a huge challenge with some of the most extremely disadvantaged students I'd ever worked with in a challenging context. And I realized that there were other things that I needed to do and tap into to help even get them on board to do the moving. And in hindsight, what I realized is there's still a lot of the things that I would have learned in my program or saw my faculty doing, but not necessarily things that I picked up on, like building how the relationship helped become a conduit for learning to happen. And that's, I think, what helped me to be successful. So again, I definitely don't think that means we need to be the primary or premier
Yeah, the solution for sure.
solution to that issue
Yeah.
across all grade levels and all content areas for all
Sure.
people, all places, at all times. Not that I'm saying that that's what you were implying by any means, but
Yeah.
I definitely think, but I say that because I definitely could see people who are more oriented to those domains to feel that way, to feel like, yeah, like this resonates with me more than some other things, right? Especially our more non-traditional movers. I think for a lot of people who teach PE and teach others how to teach PE, we've been on sports team, we played sports, we're student athletes, and we're also learners and educators at the same time. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity, but again, not to necessarily lose the essence of what physical education is, or to become, you know, overly inactive for the goal of trying to incorporate more of the social and affective dynamics.
Sure. Yep. I would argue exactly that. And I would argue that just like Hans mentioned, that it should be everybody's from a K through 12 sphere or from a societal or local community sphere, that it should be everybody's responsibility to develop the social side of a child, the mental, the health and physical literacy, all that stuff for sure. I would still argue that we are unique because we have to consider learning experiences in all 3 or 4 learning domains, and other disciplines do not, with the exception of maybe music and art, drama, things like that. But Other disciplines do not have to consider physical movement. And that's not at the expense of the other disciplines, but I think it's a great opportunity for physical education to persevere moving forward, because we allow children to be successful in many different capacities and experience success and failure to some degree, to quote the physical literacy scholars, to again, to inspire movement for a lifetime.
And so since we're at 2:08, I want to officially give people the opportunity to carry on with the rest of your day without feeling guilty about logging off. I'm happy to hang back and kind of keep the platform open, for a little while longer if individuals would like to continue the conversation, have more questions. But for those of you who have other obligations, I just want to thank you for coming. I want to thank our presenter who's still on, and our presenter that had to leave, that for sharing and having your time and availability to be here with us today when you could have been doing 100 other things. So that's much appreciated. And thank you for everyone who showed up to participate in this webinar. It is my understanding that this will be, it has been recorded. I'll say that on record, I am recording. So that this can be shared later on, so that if people who wanted to be here and couldn't be here, they can listen in and take part of the conversation asynchronously. So thank you again, everybody. But if you'd like to hang back, ask more questions, have more comments, please feel free to stay on.